Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Alhamdulillah. This is now episode 80 of the podcast Afford. Myself, Brother Mahdi Locke. And Alhamdulillah, I'm joined again by Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far al-Hanbali. And today's topic is schooling versus learning, being educated versus being knowledgeable. And so we have a series of talking points, about 9 in total. And the first one is the epistemology of knowledge. But I think we should also, before we jump into it, we should also discuss why we're doing this.
Okay. Alhamdulillah. So, one of the first reasons why, the first reason why we started doing this is because we had a number of conversations in the past about the condition of some of the Muslims in the English-speaking world, as well as the condition of even people who were not Muslim. And we kept coming down to this one issue of the 15 years of schooling that they spent and how this shapes their minds and warps their understanding. So it then came to our attention that would be a good idea at some point to discuss this.
Yeah, so to follow on from certain podcasts that we've done in the past, and there's one podcast I did on the education system where I did a review of John Taylor Gatto's book, Dumbing Us Down. But then last, 2 summers ago, we did a podcast called Who Are the Arabs, which is currently the most popular podcast on this channel. It's got well over 10,000 views, some 150 comments almost. And there are a lot of basic misunderstandings of how we understand peoples, how we understand tribes, so much so that we will probably have to go into another separate podcast on that. That came up. That's a major issue that came up. And we also did a podcast a year ago on the secular mindset, where we talked about the schooling system, how you are secularized in the school system, regardless of whatever religious background you may come from. But we need to go into this in a lot more depth to really get at how your mind is molded and shaped in Dar al-Kufr out here in the Anglosphere. Not just by school, but also by university, the media, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so the first order of business that we wanted to contend with was the epistemology of knowledge. Now, when we discuss the epistemology of knowledge, this has to do with how do we come to know that we know things? How do we gather things? Because the first thing we discuss is, well, what is knowledge? But before we can do that, it's like, how do we go about gathering knowledge? How do we go about understanding data? For those that understand fiqh, you have Usul fiqh, but then there's like Usul that has to come before this, right, that you're extracting it from. So we have to discuss, there's knowledge, but then you have to discuss the epistemology of knowledge, like where does knowledge come from? How do we go about establishing things? And so that's what I wanted to start with in the interim. So to begin with the epistemology of knowledge, we have sources that we use for trying to ascertain knowledge. The first source that we would use to try to ascertain knowledge is seeing. Now, in the course of seeing, we would use our sight to ascertain knowledge. We would do this by looking at something, observing it, coming to conclusions based upon what we see, whether it be colors, shape, size, depth, breadth, or the like. The issue with this being used as a source of knowledge by itself is there are optical illusions. You're capable of seeing mirages. There are possibilities where if you have astigmatism or other types of flaws in your vision, that which you're seeing that is real could be compromised, in which you have a perception of a reality that is wrong because your vision is flawed. Then we have another way of gaining knowledge. This is by hearing. Hearing is by using the sense of hearing through the sense of human beings' ears to hear things. And it's from hearing something that you can hear whether something's heavyset, whether it's skinny, whether it's large, whether someone that has a deep voice is tall or short, the size of something. These types of things will tell you about knowledge about the thing in question. But this can be falsified as well. And it can be falsified because The Doppler effect is just one such example. The sound of something moving away from you at a certain speed gives the indication that it's going away, but the speed at which it's going away can sometimes be deceiving for your ears. So this is a way that we use to obtain knowledge, but it's falsifiable, it's corruptible. The next tool that we would use for obtaining knowledge would be taste. And so you will notice that when children are small, they tend to be in a world of taste. They grab things, they use their mouth as a means of finding out about things that are sweet or sour or other such things. Taste as a means for gathering knowledge of something, whether something is sweet, whether something is sour, whether something is bitter, whether something is frozen, whether it's hot, whether it's spicy, whether it's not. This as a source can be falsified. It can be falsified because we can see this because a great example of this is the use of MSG, which is monosodium glutamate. Monosodium glutamate is used to imitate the taste of certain meats and the taste of certain flavors. So what happens is your taste buds believe that they're tasting chicken, when in reality they are not tasting chicken at all. Soy is used for this same purpose, to give the taste or flavor of something, right? All these things are done to give people the sensation that they have knowledge of the thing in particular. The next is we use touch as a way of obtaining knowledge about the world around us. By touching things, if we can't see it, we can't hear it, right? We can at least touch it. And by touching something, we can see whether it has a jagged edge, whether it's sharp, whether it's heavy or not. All these types of things tell us. But touch can be falsified as well, because if someone has arteriosclerosis or things such as this, sometimes feeling can be affected in their hands and feet. Sometimes if the object only has one side that's sharp and another side that's round and you're blind, this can be falsified. So touch is not a completely unmitigated source for gathering knowledge. The next is smell. Smell can be used as a source to obtain knowledge, but smell is it can often be used to tell whether something's out of date, whether it's rotten, whether it's in date, whether it's ripe, whether something's cooking all the way through, whether something smells spicy or not. You know, it's for this reason that sometimes people, if they see clothes on the floor, their own clothes, they'll pick them up, some people, and smell them. And by smelling them, that might tell them, oh yes, this is dirty because it smells like must, it smells like sweat, it needs to go in the wash. Or people will smell food before tasting it to say, oh yes, this food is done, it has a certain odor. The issue with smell, though, as a source of knowledge, is that it's capable of being falsified. And it's capable of being falsified because people in dreams will often recall smelling certain things when in reality they smelled no such thing and it was a dream. So as a source just by itself, it is a source of knowledge that can be falsified. And together, these are known as the five senses. Now, if individually they can be falsified as a source, when they are brought together, they can be falsified as a source. We then have another example of a tool used to obtain knowledge. So far, we have 5 tools used to obtain knowledge. Some people would consider it just one tool by itself, the senses. The next tool that we would use to obtain knowledge would be the tool of the intellect. And the tool of the intellect is to come to conclusions about things based upon making deductions, and this will come up later. The issue with this, though, is that the intellect can also be falsified as a tool by itself. And the reason for this is because people are born with a certain amount of intellect. One cannot increase their intelligence factor in which they become smarter. Someone can increase their mental quickness, someone can increase their alertness, but their acuity, their perspicacity, and things such as this cannot be increased. You are given the spoonful of intellect that you are given with, and that is the end of the discussion on that matter. Then we come to history. Now, history will be of examination of history texts. It will be examination of things that you have found. So I'll divide history into 2 things. The first is things that you have found. So you unearth a structure, you unearth a fossil or something along these lines. Now, that fossil being unearthed is indeed what it is. The issue that comes with history is coming to the conclusions about what that means, gathering it and putting it together, coming to the conclusions about what it represents. Then you have the history regarding of past nations, in which you would consult documents, papyri, vellum, or written books that we have today that may be printed on pulp and the like, or electronic data. The issue with this is these sources by themselves can also be falsified. We have seen examples in the news in the past few years, and more than that, of documents or even things that have been sure in our mind. We were sure that this event happened in the way that we remember it happening. But then through details and further evidence, we find that that was not the case. We then come to the final source of gathering knowledge about something. That source is revelation. Revelation is a sample or a selection of information that clearly details reality that comes to the recipient through the master or creator of the skies and the earth. And by coming through that recipient, the individual is then able to assess reality around them, in which, although he has falsifiable senses that we mentioned before, revelation can be used as the benchmark to examine, to date, to further go through, and it can also be used as a reinforcer. So if someone finds things that are doubtful, where he's used his senses or other sources of knowledge obtaining, he can use revelation to gather that data and find for sure if this is indeed the case. So these are the epistemological sources of knowledge. Now, before I stop, I'll say when we talk about knowledge, knowledge will start off as a khabar. It will start off as news. It starts off as something that's been reported or data. We then may have to go through a series of checks or examinations or deductive finds before it then reaches the next stage, in which it's now been established as a proof or something of some sort. Then once that's occurred, we then finally reach the stage where it is established as certain knowledge. As at that point that we can start to build things upon certain knowledge.
Okay, so on that point, because I think this also reminds me of, this are articles on my blog, it's Imam al-Bulti's discussion on the scientific method and how we know that something is true. And this is the first chapter of his book, Qubra al-Kiniyat al-Qawniya, because he does talk about, he mentioned these 5 things. So when information is coming to you, it's either something that's demonstrable, in which case you're relying on the senses. Because if someone says, oh, there's a fire outside, you can go outside and you can verify that, you can look at it, you can feel it, you can sense it, and so forth. But then we move on to reports, and when we have reports, we want to find out whether it's authentic, whether it's false, and then we have these sciences in Islam, like al-Jarh wa Ta'dil, and Mustalahat al-Hadith, and Ilm al-Rijal, these authentication, classification, where we're looking at all the people in the chain of transmission to see how reliable they are, how trustworthy they are, do they remember things, do they forget things, were some of them liars, were some of them,
correct,
and so on and so forth. And that's how you know that something's true or not. You're looking at the veracity of the source. And he goes on to say that in the Anglosphere, or the West in general, Europe and so forth, they have nothing like this. They have no system like this of checking. They don't have a way of saying, well, I heard this from so and so, heard from so and so, heard from so and so, and they say, well, so and so in this chain is reliable. So they have no concept of that whatsoever.
Well, what's happened to them is they have reached the point that I began with. Muslims, we actually begin with the point that I just mentioned at the beginning, these introductory remarks. What's happened, though, in these countries is they've gone to the end of the line, and now they're at the end. where they're falsifying everything. So they're saying their history is falsified. They're saying what they see is falsified, what they know is falsified, so everything's become falsified because there's no because they've realized that because the tools outside of revelation that we might normally use to verify and to come to know that something is knowledge, to go from the khabar to the knowledge stage, because they've been able to falsify every other tool used to gather knowledge, they've been able to say that none of it's true.
Yes.
And so this is where this has come from regarding gender issues. It's come up, regarding homosexuality. It's come up regarding
race.
Disease, regarding race. Because there's no tools for gathering this data, because the tools can be falsified, it just comes down to what becomes knowledge is whatever I have firm conviction it indeed is.
Yeah, which is always subjective. So
this is a motive.
So this is why, like we were saying in the last podcast, these people, they don't actually have a filter for knowledge. They don't have like we were talking about, having a confirmation bias and it's like having a healthy digestive system. They don't know how, when they're taking all this information in, or all these reports or all this data, they don't know how to sift it out and say, okay, this is authentic, we can stick to this, and then we can discard this. Then everything's falsifiable. Then what do you actually stand on?
Yeah, what is knowledge? Because once you can't establish, okay, what is knowledge? What are these details? What does all this mean? So if you find the fossil of a horse, and then you find two other fossils, and one of the fossils has a hoof, and the other fossil has two toes, and then the other fossil has two toes, and then you have another toe in the back. It's like, okay, well, what conclusion do you reach when you find that? Do you say that all these fossils existed at the same time, that one of them's from one another, or that they're in a line in which one of them comes right after the other? How do you come to a conclusion when you found these fossils all in the same sedimentary bed? How do you reach a conclusion? Because you're just at the Hubbard stage at this point. It says, okay, we found this. This is news. Now what do we do? Right? And that, I think that brings us to our discussion on the difference between intrinsic knowledge and acquired knowledge.
Yeah, because I think, again, this, like you give this example of fossils. Again, people don't understand when these, really Muslims need to pay attention to this. Like, for example, when these quote-unquote scientists in the Anglosphere or in Europe, they say, oh, we found the fossils of this animal from so many, thousands of years ago. And they'll say, this is a proof of the intermediary forms in the theory of evolution.
Sure.
But it's not proof of anything, because they've already put forward their conclusion. They've made a conclusion already and said, well, evolution must be true. And then they're fishing back, looking for evidence, and they're finding a creature. They're finding these fossils and say, okay, well, this fits in. And they don't realize that we, on the other hand, as Muslims, we believe in creation, we're going to say, well, that fossil is just what it is. That's just evidence that there was a creature that looked like this at some point in time. That's all it indicates.
Yes. I think when you look at this, it came to a discussion that I had years ago. This was, I believe, if memory serves me correct, this was in the Gregorian year of 1997. We had just come back from a geology trip, and we were discussing this, and we had for lack of a better word, a materialist missionary who, believing in evolution and that everything's there and that science proves there's no God, and just all types of other weird positions. So one of the things he said was, evolution's just a fact, and it's established beyond a reasonable doubt. You'd have to be stupid to understand otherwise. So my response, because he was just addressing a group of students, my response was, so then this is data, the information that we can attain regarding evolution. This is data in which this is inherently known, where it can be known by everyone, or is this data interpreted? This is intrinsic, or this is acquired knowledge? What is this? So I think this will be a good example of leading into what is intrinsic, what is acquired knowledge. He said, what is intrinsic? Meaning it's self-explanatory, it's established by itself. So I said, all right, so the dig that we did today, when we looked at the equus, we did some digging in Oregon, and we found equus fossils. And I said, okay, the sedimentary bed that we found these in, what is that proof of? Well, it's proof of evolution, and that they lived billions of years ago, and that this one that had toes then over time became a hoof. To which my response was, okay, well, how do we know that? Well, because we got them out of the sedimentary bed, yes, and we took them to the lab. Okay, now before we got them to the lab, is the age of them being billions of years old, is that intrinsic or is that acquired knowledge? And he had to stop short. And he said, well, that's acquired knowledge. Okay, how did we acquire this knowledge? Well, we took them to the laboratory, yes. Then after we took them to the laboratory, we subjected them to a battery of tests. Now, that battery of tests does not represent the weathering and erosion and everything else that exists in Earth's primeval or current environment outside. These are very carefully controlled elements. Then after this, the dates that they arrived at. I asked, are these dates known? They are intrinsic. Yes, they're intrinsic. Okay, so when we dug these up, the dates were written on them? No. Did they mouth these dates? No. You're going too far over the line. This is not funny. But the point I was trying to reach was, okay, how are we acquiring this information? We're getting this information. We're acquiring it. So because it's acquired, how can you say you'd be stupid not to understand it when you're acquiring this data through the battery of tests that you're doing, and then you're interpreting the data? So therefore, the evolution position that you are espousing, we're not arguing about anything else right now. We're just talking about how you got the information was acquired. And eventually he had to acknowledge, yeah, okay, it is acquired, right? This information is acquired. So then why are you saying that people are stupid to not understand that position or believe it, when how you came to understand it wasn't through any intrinsic information? You had to acquire it through the same means. You went through an educational program. There's people that you looked up to, and certain scholars of geology and other earth sciences that you looked at, and then you reached that conclusion through acquiring that knowledge. You didn't have it intrinsically. Intrinsic knowledge are things that are self-evident and can't be denied. You and I are both 3 years old, and I have a large, long stick, and we both want to play with it. I snap it in half. You and I, whether we can count to 1,000 or 1,000,000, no, those are two pieces. I now have one piece. You now have one piece. We know intrinsically that me picking up your arm will be easier than picking up your entire body. It's intrinsically known. It can be intrinsically known that opening the door of a house will be easier than physically lifting the entire house. These are things that can be intrinsically known. They don't need to be acquired. They don't need to be proven. They're things that can be established partly because of the reason that they're demonstrable. Partly for the reason that it's demonstrable. But even if they're not demonstrable, it can be known by examination. Right? So this is very important, because what's happened with acquired knowledge versus intrinsic knowledge is there's been a sort of blending. And when we went over Sharh Sunnah, I think it was last night, this issue came up that people are given the level of intellect, the level of intelligence. They're just given that portion that they're given according to what they're made responsible for. And it's not acquired. So people are giving the intelligence that they're given. Now they can increase their quickness and perspicacity, but they cannot increase actually the level of their intelligence. Now, with that being said, we then are looking at people who they're requiring people in school to come to a certain position about things in the schooling system. And even people that have a higher intellect are actually being told to stifle it or to not use it. People are all being told to have a certain level, how they're to understand information, how they're supposed to process it. And sometimes they're taking them from the khabar portion to the knowledge portion straight away, without there being any type of investigation, without there being any type of critical analysis, without them discussing the falsification of the senses and going through counter checks that are built upon that.
Because at the same time, these people, we don't understand with evolutionary biologists and these people who put forward these, who espouse these views, is they want you to think that everything is objective and it's so obvious and so self-evident, but they don't tell you, or they don't make it clear to you, or they might not even know themselves, because you had to demonstrate to this individual that they're operating within a paradigm
Yes.
that they've created for themselves, that they live within the evolutionary paradigm, and therefore everything they come across, all the knowledge they come across, or reports, whatever it is, they interpret it according to that paradigm. So again, that fossil that they found would have been, okay, that's one of the intermediate forms. That's just
Yes.
the automatic thing they jump to. And so
Yes.
it's self-evident, it's obvious. Well, no, but if you're not in the evolutionary paradigm,
You wouldn't know that.
yeah, it absolutely does not.
You wouldn't reach that conclusion.
What does reach that? Yeah, absolutely. So, and then again, the other thing about, because that statement in Sharh Sunnah, intellect is not acquired. It's a mohiba, it's something that Allah blesses you with. Therefore, we can understand that the difference between Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, Muslim Orthodoxy, and the Mu'tazila is that the intellect is not a source.
Yes.
It's not a source, no, because the intellects they're disparate. People have different levels of intellect, and therefore it cannot be a true objective source.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the Christians are in this category as well.
Yes. Yes.
All the denominations.
Most of the Christian sects have the same issue, have the same understanding.
And that's why you get this whole idea of the theodicy, the problem of evil, because good and evil can be. We discussed it in the last podcast that the good and evil can be intrinsically known. You can just know them without revelation, and therefore whatever Allah reveals can be judged according to that,
Yes.
as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah.
Which is very, very dangerous.
Yes.
Shall we move on to part 3?
Yes.
Yeah. So part 3 is why people are educated and not knowledgeable, and what is this due to? What is the reason behind this? Because we do notice something interesting happens where someone might come from a Muslim background, raised in a Muslim family, and then they go off to these secular universities, or to start off with the schools, and then they go to these secular universities to study law or engineering or biology or whatever it is,
Right.
or even medicine, and then they come back from these institutions. And it's like they almost look down on Islam. They look down on revelatory matters, and they pride themselves in how educated and progressive and advanced and modern they are, and how all these other ideas that the ulama are putting out are just, they say all these people sound like peasants and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But what you find at the same time is these people are quote unquote educated, but they don't know much about Islam. They don't know their fara'id al-wudu. They don't know the basics of the prayer. They don't know, the do's and don'ts of fasting, for example. And what we also find on top of that is they're incredibly, incredibly gullible. Like, they will not question what any of the professors teach them at university. They won't question what they're told in mainstream media. But they'll question everything about Islam.
Yes.
They'll question everything about what the ulama have said or what Allah has said. No, they'll question everything. So how does this come about? Like, what's happening to people in this situation?
All right, so this is coming down to the distinction between being educated versus being knowledgeable. Now, when someone, and we'll have to define them separately, because then I think things will come together when we move to our next point. When someone is knowledgeable, it's that they have understood and kept in mind the previous points we discussed about the epistemology of knowledge. They understand the falsification that can happen of these sources outside of revelation. But then they understand how these sources can be a supporting evidence. When in congruence with revelation, they understand how these sources can be supporting evidence when understanding the world around them. Sometimes it can be supporting if you are able to engage in enough research that will establish something to a degree that is either beyond the realms of being a lie, or it has been repeated so many times or demonstrated so many times, it would be ruled impossible or nearly impossible for it to be a coincidence or a lie. So knowledge then comes about through this particular circumstance. So when you look at the education that Muslims had or still have in certain segments of Muslim heartlands, it is very much grounded in the position of going from khabar to ilm. And it starts with establishing the usul, of matters. And the usul of matters are the foundation stone of the revelation, in which we use to understand the matters that are around us, and that the other sources of knowledge can be supporting evidences that assist us along the way. So then you get the breakdown of the usul, and the usul start with things such as our knowledge of the prayer, which will be contingent upon also knowledge of the qibla and other things such as this. Now, out of this comes the funun, right? So out of the funun, right, you get astronomy, right? Out of the discussion around fara'id or inheritance, you will get your algebra and calculus and all these other things, right? These things, so these sub-sciences, these softer sciences start coming out of the more harder developed sciences, right? So it starts with the usul first. Where's all this coming from? So you start with the epistemology of knowledge, and then the things that are an adjunct to that, that are acquired. So astronomy as a separate branch of knowledge itself is acquired after the knowledge that's to do with the affairs of Islam is covered in some detail. Now, for education, they start with destroying the usul because they understand that things can be falsified. So they start off with destroying the usul, and it begins over a very steady but accelerated rate as you get closer to the end of your schooling time. Now, the one that knows these things is viewed as educated. They know that someone's eyes can belie them. They know that someone can hear something, but it isn't truly what they heard. So those things are viewed as knowledge, when in reality they're not knowledge. They're understanding that certain levels and types of knowledge can, or certain tools used for obtaining knowledge can be falsified. Then the issue that comes after that is they are then given a worldview. And within that worldview, they are allowed to move within certain paradigms. And sometimes they will set up debates in classes or discussions and things like this. And when these debates and discussions are set up, they're allowed to move within a certain tightened framework.
Yeah, they call that the Overton window.
Yes. Now, when they move within this framework, they may debate. Now, because they're debating within this framework, there are only a limited amount of ideas that can come out of this framework. So when they then are led to the end of a maze like little mice or rats, and they reach one of the two conclusions, they think that it's their idea. And because they think that's their idea, they then begin to understand, okay, this is my position, this is who I am, I'm just trying to be me, when in reality they're trying to be like everyone else. But they're just on another side of the coin. So being educated is about conformity with the allowance of thinking that's within a certain set of guidelines, which gives you the perception that you are thinking out of the box, that you are being edgy, that you are being eclectic. And then by the time you reach university, now university and college, in the United States there's a distinction, college or community college, and then university, those should be the times where you are like breaking out of the mold. But you're not breaking out of the mold during that time. You're at this point, they have been working on you during your formative years, which we'll probably be coming to soon. They've been working on you during your formative years. And now in the years where you're starting to solidify as a human being, you're just sort of going over and carving that into stone further. And you then move within the accepted guidelines that you've been given. So if you've been given the guidelines of moving as a liberal, you move within certain liberal talking points and guidelines. And if you decide to break out of that, then you will then start to go, you'll become a centrist, or you'll become a right wing or whatever, and you'll move within those guidelines, and that's it. And you think that you're coming to new conclusions, and I've been reflecting, and over the past few years, I've decided that it's best for me if I become a conservative, or if I become a Republican, or if I become a liberal. I've been giving it a lot of thought. You've not been giving anything any thought. What's been happening is the guidelines that you've been given, you no longer wish to follow those guidelines, which lead you through another door to a new set of thoughts than you've been given. So what's happened is you don't have any real choice. You've been given a choice among the choices.
Yeah,
and then you're acting on that.
Yeah, because that's, for example, like I think again, Imam Al-Buldi raised that point about like evolution theory. Like you look at how dominant it is in the sense that when it comes to this discussion of where do human beings come from, how did we come to be, creation is completely out of the question. You can't bring it up.
Discuss it.
You can't discuss it. It has to be within the evolutionary framework. They will not tolerate.
They will say that's metaphysics.
Yeah, they will not tolerate someone saying, okay, maybe we're actually created. Maybe we didn't. No, 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 no. So if you're a professor and you do that, you're going to get blackballed. You'll get fired. You'll be dismissed as a complete. You're a kook. You lost your mind. And interesting, because we were discussing this recently. There's that book, Thomas Kuhn's book, the History of Scientific Revolutions, and he explains this point how, again, people rely so heavily on science, 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 science. And this is Thomas Kuhn. He's not a Muslim. I think he's an American professor. And Imam Abulti makes the same thing in his discussion of evolution. We talk about science, science, science. Okay, well, how come none of these people agree? Whether it's Lamarck or Darwin or Hume or whoever, these people, they always disagree on things because they're always thinking new things. And that's why Thomas Kuhn, he says the way this thing works, this thing called science that is so greatly praised and worshipped in the West, is that science constantly creates a paradigm, a geocentric paradigm, for example, a heliocentric paradigm. And the paradigm lasts only for a certain amount of time before an anomaly creeps up. And then anomaly creeps up and we have to say, okay, is this anomaly something that we can just grant as an exception? Or is it an anomaly such that it's going to grow, and then actually eventually destroy the paradigm and then create a new one? Wow. So, and he shows how this just happens again and again and again, and it's always happened. But then these people, when they write about Thomas Kuhn's book, they'll say, it's such a great book, it's a wonderful book, but the one exception to the rule, all right, the one anomaly, it's so ironic, is evolution theory, because evolution has held strong ever since. It's like, no, it hasn't. Yeah. Because you had Darwinism, then it started with Lamarckism, actually, Darwinism, neo-Darwinism. The holes are so huge, and they're just trying to patch it up, and because they're trying so hard to hang on to that paradigm. But the anomalies are just overwhelming, and they don't acknowledge them. I mean, I found a book, just before you continue, there's one book I found in a bookshop, a secondhand bookshop in Copenhagen a long time ago, a woman called Vera Barclay, called Darwin is Not for Children. And she wrote this book in the 1940s, in the Gregorian calendar. This book was published in like 1947. Wow. And she goes off on detail how it's full of holes, it's falling apart before our eyes, it has no legs to stand on. And you're thinking, wait a second, this is someone writing this 70 years ago. But people today are just championing it like it's just...
it's established.
It's established and just cannot be beaten. It's just indefatigable.
Also the thing that's important, I think, to keep in mind is Charles Darwin acknowledged at one point himself, stating that his position on the evolutionary framework was subject to finding the transitional forms and such, and that if they were not found within a century or more, that this would mean that the theory had to be revamped and tossed out, and have to be tossed out and revamped because the information wasn't found that we were looking for. So he understood that he was working within a model. The strange thing is, neo-Darwinism comes out of the ashes of Darwinism's failures and reasserts these positions that he himself said were up for discussion and were worthy of examination and scrutiny if necessary.
Yeah, and that's why. So Darwin was open to the idea that the paradigm that I've created may well be demolished in the future, and then people can move on and think about something else. But right. Instead, the universities and the politicians and so on, and the school teachers, they've just clung to this with their molar teeth, and they will never ever let go.
Right.
So. Now, the next point we're talking about here is, again, we have to go back to this 15 years of education and why they do it like this.
All right, so the 15 years of schooling. If someone wants to really get a good overhaul of this and a good examination, the type of reading you'll have to do will have to be one in which someone is doing so as a matter of personal duty. And the writings I'm referring to are those of Joseph Campbell. Those are some of the most mind-numbing, hideous, and laborious readings I've probably ever encountered as a human being. However, if someone understands Joseph Campbell's writing style, and then you also understand his rhetoric when he speaks, you can really put together a good understanding of what he believes man's origins are, the direction that man is headed in, and how man should be trained to understand his place in the rest of the creation or cosmos, or for lack of a better word. So when you're going through this 15-year educational system, he says the educational system, what it is it starts off with introducing you with basic concepts. The first one will be religion. Now, what they do initially in these school systems is the form of religion they give you is a softened, milquetoast form of Protestant Christianity. And that's why when you meet Muslims in the Anglosphere or other places, they have so much Christianity in them. Mm-hmm. You know, they'll have Christian concepts and ideas. They'll be talking about, you know, hell and heaven and all these other really weird things. And they'll ask, you know, well, how could God let this happen? They'll be using the language of the Christian. But if you were to point this out and say, well, that sounds very Christian, they would oppose you very strongly and fight you over this. They have Christian concepts about sex, Christian concepts about marriage, about child rearing. And if you press them and keep pressing, they don't know where they got this from. They have no idea where they couldn't tell you where they got this from. Right? So it starts off with simple religion. Very, very simple.
Yeah, because they use those ideas. I think just remind me of something, because there's a fatwa from al-Azhar, which Sheikh Abdul al-Qani puts in his book Manahil al-Irfan, talking about this idea of just even going as far as referring to Allah as God. That's problematic, because like, you don't know who you're calling on. You don't know who you're talking about. He said that could be something else.
Sure.
And you know, Allah has named Himself in the Quran. And so all these ideas, you know, like heaven and hell and God, and people just assume, there's this assumption because it sounds like nice religious language. Oh, it's acceptable.
It's analogous to Islam.
It's analogous to Islam. This idea of like how could Allah let this happen? How could God let this happen? And they don't understand that when Christians talk about God, they're referring to a deity that is actually limited, the deity that...
And triune in his essence.
He's triune in his essence, but he's limited. He's sort of like an equal to Shaitan. And they're battling, and it's this eternal battle between good and evil. And then again, that whole issue like discussed before, the issue of theodicy comes up. It's like, well, if we have a God who's all good, right, which is another thing, he's all good, but he's all powerful, then why do evil things happen? And they've been racking their brains over this for centuries or millennia even.
Sure.
So, you know, whatever you do, and again, we could discuss this as a side note, but we've had these discussions in private about sending your kids to sending Muslims to these secular schools, and these are the dangers. And people are like, oh well, it's not a secular school. I'll send them to a religious school, send them to a Catholic school, send them to a C of E school, and you think they're learning like morals and good. No, they're not. They're not. They're learning really, really corrupt subconscious beliefs.
Sure. So when they go from this very simple, almost childlike imaginative form of religion that everyone is made to adhere to, and the set of standards that everyone is made to adhere to. So they'll go through this kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. Then comes middle school. Now in middle school, which will usually take them 6th to 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. So you're talking about 11, 12, 13. So when they get taken to that, they will start a very brief study of science. And what they will do is they will have science classes running alongside of religion classes. Now initially that's no issue. Kids are still going to chapel. They're learning their little Christian doctrines that are boiled down. So whether they're Muslim, whether they're Sikh, whether they're Christian, they're still learning these boiled down Christian doctrines that are being given to them in these little capsules. But alongside of that is science is running. They're doing experiments and other things such as this. Then they will reach junior high school. So they're now 13 plus. And they start to introduce science, and science now starts running ahead of religion and starts being used as the reason for progress of nations and modernity. So the concept of modernity is introduced, that the inexorable march of progress, and that things that slow down the march of progress necessarily are anti-science, and they're also anti-progress, and they're not modern, they're antiquated. So they start learning these words. And then finally, when you get to the ending portion of junior high school, which is 8th or ninth grade, so now you're 14, 15, you're starting to enter into your high school phase, what will happen is you now get the introduction that religion is a myth. The reason why we taught all you this in the first place is that we taught it to you because you weren't ready for science yet. You know, you when you looked at fire, you were scared, and so you made up a god to try to protect you from it, where you didn't know what death was, so you had to do all these other things. Now you've reached a point in which we can now tell you that the story is over. All of this was only symbolic. None of this is real. The only thing that's real is science and the material world around you. And it's at that point that you usually might get introduced to the books of Carl Sagan or Isaac Asimov, and especially you will be introduced to Joseph Campbell at some point in high school, in later high school, or at university, to further undergird and undermine other things. So they'll start comparing ancient Egyptian and primitive cultures and the Yoruba and things like this, and Islam and Christianity and Judaism, and say this is all coming from man's primitive attempts to try to live on in immortality. And you notice that, you know, when man makes his gods, he makes them in his own image, and these gods are capricious, and they're this, and there's these other things, right? So it took you that 15 years to get from the beginning of that process to the end, in which you started off as a nominal Christian, and at the end of it, you came out of it a full-fledged secularist and atheist. And everyone, whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a Hindu, is subjected to the exact same structure and model.
Yeah, and when the way you describe that system, you can see clearly how, at the end of it, whether someone admits to it or not, it's buried in the subconscious. It's engraved in the subconscious that religion and science are two separate things.
Sure.
Religion and science they're mutually exclusive categories. One does not bear on the other, and that's why, as we discussed last year in the secular mindset, you'll see Muslims who, even if they're educated in Islam, I'll use the word educated, you know, they've studied Usul al-Fiqh, they've studied theology, and so on and so forth, but they will never ever use any of that stuff, especially because, again, Usul al-Fiqh, as we mentioned earlier, Usul al-Fiqh has all these discussions about khabr yaqini, khabr dhanni, you know, or like this khabr yufid al-dhann, how the khabr yufid al-yaqin. Like, we have reports, and this would indicate, this gives us knowledge, or this gives us, you know, conjecture to an extent. It doesn't give us certain knowledge. There are all these methods that the man lay out, like looking at tawatur.
Yes.
Right? Something is mass transmitted. It's come from so many different channels that it's impossible all those people conspired to lie. Right? Like, you know, I've never been to Thailand, for example, but I've seen it on a map. Every atlas that I've opened has Thailand.
There are planes that go there.
And planes that go to the
We've
airport.
met people from there that are speaking a strange language.
They claim to be from there.
Yeah, they claim
right?
to be from there. They have a certain look like no one else has. They're speaking a language that we have no evidence for, except that it is from those people.
Yeah, so that would tell you that this is a certain knowledge. Everyone knows that Thailand exists. You know, another example they give in a book, Usul al-Fiqh, they'll say, for example, there's some things that, if they were true, they would by necessity have been transmitted to us. You know, one book I was reading recently, al-Hajj Fi Usul Tashri' al-Islami, the Sheikh was explaining that, you know, if there's a masjid that you go to on a frequent basis, and someone, or you know about, and you know people go there, and it's now Tuesday, and you've heard that, and someone tells you on Tuesday, oh yeah, last Friday at that masjid, you know, there was a huge fire broke out, and this happened. He's like, well, wait a second. If that were true, I would have been told that, because I know people who go there, they're frequent there. You're the first person to tell me? I dismiss that. You know, so there are all these tools that are laid out in Usul al-Fiqh and in theology for how you know whether something is true, whether you know something is not, whether something is giving you knowledge, whether something is giving you conjecture. That's all there. But we have Muslims who study all these things, but then they simply do not apply them outside of the scope of, quote-unquote, religion. So these same Muslims who have all these tools, or even the ayat in the Quran, where in Surah Al-Hujurat, where Allah said, what was it? When جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا. Right? So if a fasiq, if an untrustworthy person comes to you with some information, check it. And when riwayah fatathabbitu, you know, establish it, make sure that it's valid. That's all there. But these same people, they won't question, you know, global warming, they won't question vaccines, they won't question certain viruses, and so on and so forth. Everything's accepted, whole meal, nothing is questioned. So the root of this, and Allah knows best, the root of this is that there's this complete break between religion and science.
Correct. So this then puts us at, what does college and university do to the individual? And we sort of touched on this a little bit previously. The college and university experience is supposed to be one in which you start to push against ideas that you've learned. You start to re-examine and to go through and rebel against, because now you've got all these libraries at your disposal. You've got all these books, all these research journals, all these other scientific papers that are being written. But instead, what you're doing is you're inside of a fenced-in garden and you're eating leaves from the hedges. And what I mean by that is you're not doing anything but taking from the same things over and over and over again. And you're allowed to do research to the degree that it supports the structure. Mm-hmm. And so it's just creating the same situation over and over. It's replicating it. Now, how is this arrived at? Because someone may say, well, Brother Abu Ja'far, that's crazy, because all someone has to do is to do any level of careful reading and they'll see the system for what it is. It will unravel and everything else. That would be true if people were functionally literate. The game of education is that people are functionally illiterate. And here's what I mean by this. When we discuss literacy, you have two forms in general. You have simple illiteracy. This is where they cannot read and write. This doesn't make someone stupid. It just means that maybe they weren't able to go to school, they lived in a very remote area and didn't have access to education that would give them the ability to learn the alphabet and other things such as this. So this is simple illiteracy. Functional illiteracy is where you are taught to read and write, but you were taught to read and write in order to pass exams, to pass quizzes,
to pay your bills,
to go by bills and league tables, things like this. You'll find that some of the people that are illiterate and have these degrees, that have these degrees, they don't have critical reading skills. So people were so surprised at how those girls from Bethnal Green took off all of a sudden and went to live with Daesh. And it's, how could this happen? Because, one of them was a 2-1 and one was a straight A student. When I saw that makes perfect sense, because they're taught to regurgitate these details to learn how to pass the exams that will give them the A+ or the 2-1 or the first and all these other things. But to actually sit down and read and to examine what you're reading. Okay, what does this mean? What does this statement entail? Okay, well, do I hold to that position that they've stated? Is this position coming from a place of bias? And then you go through the process of examining whether a statement's coming from bias. Is it coming from bias? Where's this examination come from? Where's the proof for this? Where's the evidence? Are there footnotes? Are there endnotes? Let me check the bibliography, right? Questions that should be occurring to them never do, because that's not how they're taught to read. They're taught to read with the goal of getting them through school, and that's it. And you'll notice so many people that have been through school, what happens after they finish going through school? They don't want to read anymore. Yeah. I'm done reading. I did my education. I'm done now.
SubhanAllah. And this is one of the things, again, John Taylor Gatto and I have, there's a podcast on this channel, and I was also on something on my blog where I wrote a summary of his book, Dumbing Us Down. He has lots of books on the education system. This is someone who was a New York State, he won awards as the New York State top teacher, New York City teacher. He was in the teaching system for over 30 years, the government teaching system. And he said he had to break the law just to get stuff done, because you're not allowed to say certain things, not allowed to do certain things. And what he says in his book, he says like, what do we really teach at school? And one of the things he said is we teach the disconnectedness of everything. You're taught, what we're training kids in is we're making them realize that everything is disconnected. You go into geography class for 45 minutes and then the bell goes, you get cut off, and then you're in another class. And then now you're doing mathematics for 45 minutes and the bell goes, cut off. And you're never allowed to sit and process and put all these things together. So it creates like almost a multi-personality disorder. You don't know where anything fits in. And that's why these people Again, they're not trained to think deeply about a matter and to question things. And if you do question things at school, if you do try to think for yourself, you will get put in line very, very quick. If you question the narrative that they're giving you. We've had discussions about this. I remember, my dad told me this when he went to good private schools in the United Kingdom, when they were studying the life of Christopher Columbus, and Christopher Columbus arrives in North America, what became North America, and he finds the natives there, and the various native tribes. But the whole topic is referred to as the discovery of North America, right? The discovery. So, my dad is just, he's probably a teenager at this point. He just asked the question. He says, "Wait a second. Why are we calling it the discovery of such and such place if there are people already there? If there are people already there, shouldn't we be calling it the European discovery of North America because it's Europeans are coming there now? How can it be the discovery when someone's already there?" No, shut up. Don't talk about that. All right. So you're always taught. I'm sure you have plenty of examples of this yourself.
Yeah. I mean, these things happen because the goal is, your job is to digest the material without chewing. When you digest the material, your job is to swallow the material. You don't chew. You just swallow it, and that's it. You're taking in food like how a very simple animal would take in food. And the goal is not for you to think about what you're giving. Although they would say that you're being taught to think, and that's how I learned how to think, and this is where you got your education. But in reality, that's not what's happening to you. Yeah. What's happening to you is you're actually being shut off from thinking. And I remember a married couple coming to me and being very worried because they enrolled their children in one of these secular schools. And they said, our son was so active and so inquisitive at home, and he was asking questions all the time, and we would get into these scientific things and look at what's going on with the trees outside and everything else. And now he just wants to sit down. He doesn't want to. When we try to engage him on these topics, he doesn't want to do it anymore. He's just tired because he's been for 8 hours. He's just been told, shut up, sit down, eat, do this. He's just exhausted. He doesn't want to do those things. They saw his creativity and the level of his yearning and zest for knowledge just go down,
disappear.
And so they said, okay, we've got to pull him out while he's still with us, while he's still conscious. And so they yanked him out. And since that time, he's been learning, and they found out he has a photogenic memory and all these other things. And all of that would have been completely laid waste had they just left him in that minefield.
Yeah, and that's not just one anecdotal story. That happens over and over and over again. So many parents will say that about their children, that this is how they were. They were so bubbly and full of energy and like always asking questions, and then they go to school and that quickly dies down, disappears. And this is why I talk about simple literacy and functional literacy. This is why that when you go to that school system, you never actually learn to study a topic thoroughly, or in a systematic fashion from beginning to end, or to read a book from beginning to end. And I think a common example, we were discussing this recently, is we look at some of the podcasts or the lessons that you have on your channel, the Reasons for Faith channel, like the Science of the Time, or the 13th Century Islamic History, or the Tafsir of Imam al-Jawzi, where you're just going through the whole thing from cover to cover.
Chronological order.
And the Science of the Time. Like, again, this is something that when Muslims talk about the Science of the Time, all they can do, and it's not just your common Muslim, but the people who claim to have knowledge of the Science of the Time, and they're the ones who have lectures, and they go on massive public forums, they just quote piecemeal stuff to you. This will happen, and this will happen, and then this will happen. But they can't give you an actual chronological order as a sequence of how these events happen, how they're going to occur, how they're going to affect one another, what should we be looking out for, what has already happened, what age are we in now, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. Sometimes they'll jump straight to. I remember seeing one of the moderators on the channel. He showed me the first analytics for the channel when they first went up, and what it was the lectures to do with the prophecies that have been fulfilled. Their opening views were quite low, but then Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, Nabiyuna Isa Islam, the Mahdi, and Ya'juj and Ma'juj, they had like 400 views, 60 views. People were jumping straight to those, even though they're in chronological order. The order that these prophecies are being fulfilled and everything else. People were jumping straight ahead and then asking questions about information. There's no sources for this, there's no sources for that. Not realizing that the first video has all of the sources and introduction. As is our custom at the beginning of our first class, we always lay out what our methodology is, what we're using, what our sources are, how do we establish our sources, everything else. So what happened is the administrator, he wound up putting under each video, please see the first video. So all 29 videos have, please see the first video.
Yeah. For sources and references
Yeah,
and so on and so
but
forth.
you still had questions that were being sent to me by email. Why didn't you look at this? There's no sources for this. They didn't actually see in the subject line that it was there, and it was just another indicator to me of functional illiteracy. They're jumping straight to, because they think they know these topics. So they're trying to, okay, I know this topic. Let's try to see what zesty things he said in here. It's like, well, actually, these things are tied to all the other topics before. But they're just like carrying something through from beginning to the end is not something that's encouraged through the education system. Your job is to take a snatch of this, a snatch of that, a snatch of this, a snatch of that. But the goal is not to complete anything. It's only to take a handful of something.
Yeah, it's microwave Islam.
Yeah, and this is what's happened. So when people get out of school and they're feeling religious or feeling spiritual and they want to get religiously zooted or religiously high, they say, okay, well, let me crack open the old religious text and read something that blows my little mind, and I feel high now, and let me go pray some prayers and do some other things, because they think, okay, that's how I'm supposed to acquire knowledge, because they do it the same way they do in school.
Yeah.
Versus learning something like sitting down. Some of the people, you'll find it's very, very difficult for them to focus themselves and to zero in on learning even a small text. It's very difficult for them to zero in and stay focused. But they'll watch hours and hours on hours of game shows or reality TV or these other things. They can stay totally zeroed in on this type of stuff. They can play, they can have a controller in their hand and play that. One guy, it came up in one of my feeds on YouTube. I was looking at a documentary, and this came up in a feed on the recommended side. I said, okay, I wonder what this is about, because it had said something about unboxing. And so I said, let's look at it. So I looked at it, and this guy said, are you looking to increase your productivity if you're playing all day? How to keep your fingers from getting sore and everything else. So he had like these special glasses and these special things you could put on your fingers to keep from getting sore fingers. And that way, you could play all day without interruption. And then he said, one of the things about why he loves being married to his wife is on Sunday, his wife says, okay, this is the day where I don't bother you at all. You can just close the door to the room and you can just be on there all day. I won't bother you. And so he thinks, oh, this is great. My wife's leaving me alone. No one's bothering me. I can just play indefinitely. And that's the type of thing that the education system has helped put in place. Now, the education system primes you for everything else. So it's like the media, music, entertainment, it all feeds into that. But that first step, before you can properly come into everything else regarding the media and sports and entertainment, you first got to go through that education system.
Yeah. And that's what I realized. I think when I accepted salvation in the year 2000, like going back to this, I always used to question that. I always think it was very, very weird, because going through high school especially, and noticing how, like, in all the classes I took, we never read one book from cover to cover. We never did one subject all the way through. It was always piecemeal. I was like, why are we doing all the units of the book? Why are we only doing select units or select pages? Then on top of that, I don't know, maybe I'm not the only one, but I noticed, how you'd have these online surveys or these personality tests.
Yes.
And when they create these personality tests to find out what kind of person you are, right? It's within that paradigms. And the way you're defined is, what kind of clothes do you wear? What movies do you like?
Closed questions.
What music do you like? Sure. What sports do you like? And it's closed questions. So you're thinking, because again, and I saw this in my high school in Canada, and something different, because people fit into these categories, are like are you like a rapper? Are you a rocker? Are you a skater? Are you what? All these fixed categories that you're supposed to be in. And I remember actually just as a high school kid looking at this and thinking like, wait a second, are these contrived categories? Like, why do those guys dress like this and listen to that kind of music and listen and watch those kinds of movies and like those sports, and those people wear black clothes and listen to heavy metal music, and those people, it's like, this is not natural. Yeah. This is very, very clearly contrived.
Yeah. It's something that's been made for them. It's been created for the express purpose that they would fall into that category, and then they say, okay, well, this is for you now. And then they would think that by their gravitating towards it, being pulled into the whirlpool, this is the conclusion I've come to because I found myself. Or did something find you?
Yeah, because they think like, I'm listening to hip hop music now. I'm listening to heavy music. I'm rebellious. No. You're all that money you're spending on those CDs. That's what it was back in the 90s. Yeah. And that's all going back to the same corporations.
David Geffen, all these different people, all these record companies. The stuff that you think is supporting these people, it's like, no, these record execs, they're the real gangsters. They're the ones that are getting all the money. They're the real all-stars because they're getting all that money.
Yeah, and then that primes you. That you with that system. Now you're primed perfectly for when the media is then going to tell you, when your university professor, they're going to tell you stuff, and they're going to tell you that you need this vaccine, or we're going to go to war, and you need to support it. Yes. You just fall for it because you've been absolutely primed for it.
Yeah, if you can't support it with your dollars, try to go and join and fight. If you can't do that, at least go over and support them. If you're a comedian, you go over and you provide comedic outlet for them. Or if you can't do that, you do all these other things. But you must support them no matter what. And then you have to come to a conclusion about other things. Like there's certain positions you have to hold regarding drugs. Certain positions you have to hold about child rearing. There's certain positions you have to hold about diet and consumption and health.
And so you look at the U.S. now, for example, and the UK as well, like these Antifa and BLM marches. I mean, these people, they're so adamant. They think they're taking to the man and they're going against the system. It's like, oh, hold on a second. All those ideas you have in your head, because all those guys are university educated. Some of them are actually professors.
Yes.
So those ideas you have in your head, you got them from nice universities. You went to Berkeley, and you were taught that Marxist stuff by some guy in a 10 years salary.
And these are not organic movements. They're coming about. They're pre-planned, because if you look at these marches, the great bulk of them, you have to get police escort. So they're calling ahead and saying, listen, we're counting on this many thousands of people being present. We need a police escort. So it's not spontaneous. Spontaneous is where it just happens and no one knows what's going on. And
like the LA riots.
Yeah, the LA riots, that's like spontaneous. Right? The Watts riots is spontaneous. Those are things, the stuff that happened in Oakland in the 90s, that stuff was spontaneous. There were no police cordons, there were no placards. Things happened, they escalated, and it went from there.
Yeah, so these people who now put themselves forward, they think they're so anti-establishment, they're taking it to the man, and you have to ask, okay, you're taught this stuff by your Marxist professors at your nice universities, you're getting funding from all the top corporations in the U.S. They've admitted to this, various restaurant chains and soft drinks manufacturers, and I mean, even the UN was endorsing Antifa, putting it on Twitter, saying, yes, they're fighting fascism, so on and so forth. So how on earth are you anti-establishment? You've been completely and utterly groomed, for want of a better word, for what you're doing.
You are controlled opposition.
You're establishment. You're completely controlled opposition. You've just been rushed off a conveyor belt. That's what an ideological conveyor belt. There's no original thought there whatsoever.
And that's what brings us then to our next point, which is the workplace of ideas. The workplace of ideas, it starts with now people coming in and saying, okay, well, because we're not left, that necessarily means we're right. And because we're not conservative, that means we're liberal. And if we're not, fiscal conservatives, that means that we're liberals. And because we're social conservatives, that means we're, this. So these workplace of ideas are positions that you're given. And even the talking points is like, are you pro-life or pro-choice? It's like, even the terminology is like off. It's like, well, pro-life, who's pro? It's like how
Who's
can
pro-death?
Yeah, who's pro-death? Who's against choice? It's like, no one deserves choice. Who's against choice? No one's against choice. And the situation isn't that. It's you're either in favor of life or that these children they get killed. That's all there is to it. So the workplace of ideas pours ideas into your head through this education system. As they're putting the ideas in your head, you then are going through the 3 stages of development that happen with a student and a teacher, and also happen with a child and its parent, his or her parent. Now, this is important because none of the other things that happen are possible without this process. The first stage that occurs is what's known as sohbah, which is companionship. People are learning things. They may not know the evidence behind it initially, but the parents are teaching their child, or a parent is teaching the child. Maybe one parent's in charge of teaching it. So the child is learning these things, and they're coming to conclusions, right? So initially, they're just recording the data. They're learning, they're being told, they're being rewarded for their good works, and then they're also being disciplined for their bad works and told, oh, don't do that, or avoid that, or they're being warned against it. The next process that comes is the ghuraba, which is the estrangement or the stranger phase of this. Now, this happens where the child or the student comes to a point where they take away the information and they start to process it. They try to implement it. They go through things. So there's a estrangement that occurs. And that sometimes parents say, oh, I really miss my son or I really miss my daughter because, they're off in their own world and they're in their room and they don't talk as much and everything else. Well, they're coming to grips with what they're processing, coming to an understanding, try to grasp it and everything else. And that's the point that the tape recorder is pressing play. And then in the sohbah, the second sohbah stage, which is stage 3, then they rejoin you in companionship, and your relationship then becomes deeper than it was when they were a child, because now they've realized, having reflected on, gone through things, examined stuff, that what you had told them has come to be the case. They've established that. So these 3 phases are the case with the student and teacher, and they're also the case with the parent and the child. Now, what the education system does with this is they take the children in when they're in the sohbah stage. And so when that happens, the child is brought in during the sohbah stage. Now, the parents are the ones that take the child home, but there comes a point where when the parent is first dropping the child off, the child's crying. Why? Because it's wanting the sohbah of its parents. But then there comes a point where they cry if they have to go.
Yeah.
So now that transformation, because they realize that the people with the food, the people with the authority, the people with this are the school. And when the school reports and says your child's doing this, the parents then reinforce what the school wants. Don't worry, we'll get on them tonight. We'll make him do it. And they realize, okay, so the power isn't with my parents. It's with these. And then when the ghuraba stage happens, it's like the ghuraba, they're put into ghuraba like early, the estrangement stage. And the estrangement stage, right, that stage gets extended and the sohbah stage gets lost.
They never come back.
Yeah, they don't come back because they say our parents are stupid. Especially, it's so weird that it's thought that the parents are stupid because they're fluent in more than one language. The parents, they know English, but they don't know English exclusively. They know English and they know this language and that language. Our parents are so stupid. This idea gets driven into them. So this ghuraba stage, it gets extended. And during that happening, they start to look down on every good thing their parents may have taught them, everything they've ever learned, and everything that they've ever acquired. And so going through that stage, they don't go back to the sohbah stage. So they now see themselves in competition with their parents. And that's why you get, kids, well, my son was fine. And then in high school, he started, getting up from the table and flipping the table over or talking back to his mom and everything else. It's like people found out he wasn't doing that before. Now he's talking back to his dad and telling his dad, yeah, what about it, old man? And things like this. Like, where's all this coming from? Yeah, the teachers might not be telling him to do that, but the mold that he's being put in, the process that he's going through, the seasoning that he's undergoing is creating this environment. And so it gets extended, that ghuraba stage. And it's like, that's a catastrophe. Because by the time he goes to college or university, even if his name might be Muhammad Abdul Rauf, he may be kafir for all intents and purposes, because he started out as a Christian, then gradually became a secular Christian about this, and then at the end of it, it's just a full-blown secularist.
Yeah. And I think also just on a note for listeners, if you want further reading on this, I would highly, highly recommend the book Teen 2.0, The Case Against Adolescence by Dr. Robert Epstein. Because that book is an argument showing how this whole concept of the teenager, because yes, teenage is a word in the English language, for someone who's 13, 14, 15 through to 19, but teenager is it's a complete innovation. It's a bid'ah. It was invented in the 1930s. I think it first appeared in the English language in either 1937, 1938, depends what dictionary you consult. But this idea of a transitional phase between childhood and adulthood is completely made up. And this is a really, really horrific stage for children because they're actually adults, right? According to us, if a boy has had his wet dream, if a girl has started her cycle, they're actually adults. They're technically adults. They're supposed to be treated as adults, but they're being treated like children, and they have so many restrictions put on them, and it really, really messes them up. And that's why they always talk about the rebellion phase, right?
Yeah, because it's to instill the ghuraba phase further. Because when you notice during this so-called rebellion phase, they're not rebelling against the school system.
It's against their parents.
They're rebelling against their parents. They're not rebelling against what they're being taught in psychology class. They're rebelling against their parents.
Yeah, and that's why they do stuff like they start smoking, or they start doing drugs, or they start
premarital sex,
all that kind of stuff. And but it's designed that way. It's designed that way, and that's why what he does in that book, Robert Epstein, no relation. What he does is he shows how this idea is not only completely new, but cultures throughout the world don't do this. Whether it's in Latin America or Africa or Asia, people don't do this. People just go from childhood to adulthood. You just jump up. You don't have this whole dragging out like he has to be 18. 18 is complete fiction.
And you usually have, in these cultures, if I could say, you usually have rites of passage in the build-up to adulthood.
Yeah.
Whereas what's going on when they extend the ghuraba stage is the rites of passage are eliminated.
Yeah.
And measurements in terms of good or reaching levels is measured in terms of material achievement. I've got a car now.
Yeah.
I'm 16 now. I've got my driver's license now.
Mm-hmm.
I've got this. So rites of passage are measured by material achievements.
I can vote now.
That's it. Oh, I'm someone. Right.
Yeah. I got my first bank account or something like this. And I think also I just want to go back to something you touched upon about how when they create this workplace of ideas, how it's always a dichotomy, right? I think especially when it comes to beliefs and opinions. So like you're either you're liberal or you're conservative, you're a Republican or you're Democrat, you're Labor, or you're and the absence of one necessitates the presence of the other.
That's right.
So if you're not A, then you must be B. And isn't it interesting? Isn't not interesting? For example, that when you look at Muslims in the Anglosphere, you can't see these same dichotomies pop up over the time.
Sufi, Salafi.
Sufi, Salafi, Brelvi, Deobandi, this. If you're not this, you're this.
Tablighi, Dawati.
Yeah, right? And it's always that assumption. If you're not a Sufi, you must be a Salafi. Not a Salafi, you must be a Sufi.
And then if you show that you belong to a third rail, like you're the third, okay, the brother's confused.
Yeah.
Because they've tried to find this, like, no, you're confused. That Muslim brother, Muslim sister is not confused. They just refuse to abide by these circumstances that you put them in.
This taxonomy.
Yeah, so they say, oh yeah, he's confused. No, you're confused because you're the one that's inside of the structure and trying to find somewhere to pigeonhole them or put them. And then instead of finding that, when you don't find somewhere to put them, you're like, okay, well, they must just be confused. Eventually they'll figure it out.
Yeah, because the way they look at, when you're not in that bracket of Sufi Salafi, they look at you as if you're like the Green Party in the U.S. or something. Like, what's wrong with these people? Don't they know that they'll never win a presidential election? They want to get on the debate stage. You need to be part of one of the two major parties.
They want full ballot access. They better get started. That's that thought.
You can't be like Green Party or Libertarian Party or anything like that. You have to be. And no, it's like these two categories, this dichotomy, this binary setup is fake. It's fake, and it's amazing. But again, Muslims in the Anglosphere have this. They've been through the school system, and it's perfectly set up for them.
It's not by coincidence.
Yeah, it's not by coincidence. Because I mean, you don't really see that in the Muslim world so much.
No, what you tend to find in circumstances like that is there'll be someone who's Muslim, but he might be struggling with a particular sin.
Yeah,
like it's like, okay, well he smokes,
yeah.
Or he doesn't justify it, or he doesn't say, I found myself.
Yeah,
this is who I really am. I'm expressing my wider me or something like that. It's like, no, this is something I struggle with. So you'll meet people who, he prays 5 times a day, but he smokes. He prays and he fasts, but, he works at the type of employment that he shouldn't. But he knows that it's wrong. He's not trying to justify it. He doesn't say, it's 2020, I need to do what I need to do.
Yeah, and that's what I found. Like my experience in the Muslim world is that also that when, like, if let's say someone is secularized for a period of time in their life, or they're remote from Islam for a certain period of time in their life, maybe for several years, and then they want to have certainty and they want to have a relationship with Allah, they're going to go back to Islam.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to go back to their local masjid, back to their local imam,
back to the sheikh that taught him.
Yeah, and then they go from there. Whereas that never happens when you see people in the Anglosphere, people in the U.S. or Canada or Britain, like if they want to get religious later on,
they do the John McEnroe Islam.
Yeah, they do that, or they'll join some weird New Age cult, or they'll try Buddhism or Hinduism or something, or any weird. They'll never go back and think, maybe I should go back to the Church of England, or maybe I should. Yeah. No,
they don't do any of that stuff, and so what'll happen is they'll join this crazy stuff. They'll get involved with these crazy groups, and they'll go off the deep end. And then rather than saying, well, it's my personal misgivings and it's my personal proclivities that led to me finding failure in these groups and everything else, they'll say, no, it's the fault now of Islam. No one helped me, or no one could help you because you were so stupid at the time, or so foolish at the time, or so unable or unwilling to accept any rebuke or correction that you just ran straight forward to the first thing that you could find.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of these people, again, a lot of these, say, newly committed believers or converts as well, again, I've said this before in previous podcasts, and I think put in my book, The Big Step, is that a lot of these people, again, they're not coming with like the best of intentions. They're not saying, okay, this is the truth, I'm going to submit to it, and then once I've submitted to it, I'm going to serve it. No, they're looking at it differently. They're looking as okay, I'm doing Islam a favor. I'm becoming Muslim.
It's the truth if it fits my needs.
Yeah, and what can Islam do for me? Can Islam make me feel soft and fuzzy inside? Can Islam make me feel comfortable?
And then if it doesn't, or if there's things that they're not comfortable with, well, let me just prune this tree.
Yeah.
Just start doing some clipping here, clipping there, remove a branch here, remove a branch there.
Yeah, it's like a all you can do buffet Islam. Like, I'll take some of that, but I won't have some of that, and this is good, but no, I don't want any of that. And these kind of people, they can't really be helped because they need to go back and understand and ask themselves the serious question as to why they're in that situation. So, okay, so we've gone over all these points. So I think now we're at this stage. We've talked for quite a while. We need to look at solutions on that note.
Okay. When we talk about solutions to the circumstances that are in front of us, one of the things is we have to go back to Usul. So what I mean by this is that parents and Muslim children have to start from a foundational point in which they learn their Usul first before going into Funun. If you're in an environment, let's say that there's a circumstance that you're in where you have no choice whatsoever, but that your children have to go into an environment like this. Let's say there was some emergency some way, somehow. Whether there is or there is not, the children have to start by learning their usul first. So they must learn the foundations of their faith, the 6 pillars of Iman, and then the extension of that, some creedal text or formulation that is agreed upon by everyone. This example is the Creed and Way of Muslim Orthodoxy. This has 3 creed texts within it. This has the basis of what someone should be studying. The Quran, its proper reading and recitation, and a certain level of Arabic to where they can discharge their salah and their duties and read if the case be. A certain level of fiqh that they should know in order to discharge their responsibilities. All these things should be known before they go into that system in any way, shape, or form, because what's happening is the system stands on its funun. When the funun themselves, the branches, come from the foundations, they destroy the foundations using the branches. They need the foundations. So when they come in to study these branches, they can say, okay, some of that's correct, but then some of it's not. Some of this is correct, some of it's not. And they can do their own research. They can go through examination. They can come to conclusions. They may come home and say, I found this, I found that. What does that mean? Or where can I research more about that? These are the type of things you'll want to be wary of, mindful of, and to be very, very clear that you want your children to learn these things. So learning the usul is not, it's not an option, it's a compulsory thing.
Okay, so that's the first solution. The second solution is the difficult task of separating between received culture and handed down culture.
Okay, so received culture and handed down culture. Received culture is what has been given to you. So there are some Muslims in which they may have undergone the colonial period. So they were conquered over. Now the culture that came out of that was given to them. That was given to them. It's not the culture that they grew. That culture was given to them. And you can see it today. There's certain cultures where the way they dress, the way they eat, then the things that they eat are not actually indigenous to their country. They're things that have been given by an outside invading power. They need to go through some type of assessment phase where they decide what things they're going to keep from that culture and what things they will discard. The things that do not belong to the revealed law must be discarded and denied. Versus handed down culture. The handed down culture are the things from the revealed law of the Rasul ﷺ, what is consensus, these types of things. And there are aspects that we've been given of the culture of Islam that these are things that are perfectly acceptable. We should have rites of passage, when the child turns 7 years of age. A big to-do should be made about this. When he reaches adulthood, and he's going through the different steps of adulthood, these things, much should be made out of this, because these are important phases in the life of a human being that's going from childhood into adulthood. So these types of things, handed down culture, is much more important than received culture. Now this will put you into a clash at times. You're not looking for the clash, but it will come with people who are either satisfied with or don't realize that there's a distinction between the received culture versus the handed down culture. And you just have to be steadfast and to continue forth and to be fearless, but also patient with the difficulties that you're going to undergo, because it's going to happen. You're going to have difficulties because there's some people who, in these ossified cultures, like if you looked at Ottoman culture, that's gone, alhamdulillah, but some of its vestigial organs remain. And one of those is bureaucracy, right? Terrible bureaucracy that plagues parts of the Muslim world, right? These things have to be let go of, and if necessary, destroyed.
Yeah, so these are things that where you have to sit back and assess, why does this happen? Why has this happened? Why is this in place? Because again, like you look at what's called the Middle East, Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and so forth. They've got that Ottoman leftover, like what they call the Tanzimat,
yes,
from 1839. Although that's where all the bureaucracy started. These massive ministries,
and those were supposed to be reforms. Can you imagine what was there before?
Yeah, subhanallah. And again, and then if you're looking at, say, for example, the Indian subcontinent, a lot of people who've migrated from the subcontinent come to the UK. You have to look at the cultural roots of a lot of things that are going on. What did the British do when they were there? What languages did they give you? What education system did they give you?
What did they allow you to do?
And what did they allow you to do? I mean, I think it would be worthwhile for to ask yourself, like, the culture you have now, is that a culture that you've always had, or is it from that era? Is it from the late 1700s in the Gregorian calendar and so on and so forth? I remember first coming across it. I didn't read the book, I confess, but I watched the BBC drama of Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen in the late 1700s. The culture in there has a lot of similarities. These are English people from that time, and they're extremely, extremely conscious of what the community is going to say, who are our daughters going to marry, and
saving face.
And if we don't marry them off, what are the neighbors going to say? What are the locals going to say? And then, we've married, we found a guy and he's really wealthy. This is great. The neighbors will say good things. And then there's a cousin who's a clergyman. Gotta force her to marry him. And she's refusing. And oh my God, what are we going to do? So you have to ask, okay, well, is is your culture, is it organic to you, or was it influenced? Was it put upon you?
Was it given to you?
Was it given to you by these people of that age?
Because it can't be a coincidence that these two things are matching. One must have come from the other.
Yeah. And then you have to ask yourself why these same English people, they no longer have those cultural norms.
They cast it off because they realized how destructive it was.
Yeah, so these are a lot of things you have. So you have to go through that kind of process of asking yourself, okay, well, it goes back to like point number one, the epistemology of knowledge, but asking yourself, why do I have these ideas? Why do I think these? Why do I think these things? Why do I have these fears, these apprehensions? I have a whole chapter in the Big Step about this, about getting over your childhood. Asking yourself why you might have certain proclivities, why you might have certain fears and apprehensions and anxieties. But that's like a micro scale. You want to take it to a macro scale and sort of look at the wider culture. Like, why are we as a people inclined towards this or disinclined towards this?
How much of what we say is us is us?
Yeah, exactly. The next thing we've written down here is the erection of new institutions to convey age-old knowledge.
So what this will mean is, in the Anglosphere, people will have to do something that's not been done here yet, which is namely to create structures and institutions that will continue through with teaching these usul and these principles. Right now, we don't yet see in the English-speaking world institutions that are set where there's an exchange. There'll be scholars that are brought over from the Muslim heartlands, and then in exchange for that, there'll be people that'll be sent over to the Muslim heartlands to study. Then after a number of years, they'll exchange them back, right? Mm-hmm. So that way the people always have access to knowledge, they have a foothold in the Muslim world, and the authority of the Muslim world, the Muraja, and the authorities in Islam is established in their midst. This doesn't happen, so people are sort of go it their own way. If you're going to establish anything, if it's going to be worth anything regarding Islam, whether you're going to be autonomous or whether you're going to create some other structure that will be an entity in and of itself, irrespective of whichever of those two things you're going to do, you must have the institutions to do it. You have to have the framework and the infrastructure to do it. So you'll need to create new institutions because these institutions, this framework, this structure, it does not exist yet.
Yes. So, because again, I think this is something we've talked about also, that in recent conversations about how, for example, you look at I always tell them to look at examples of non-Arab Muslims, and we talk example of, say, Muslims in Malaysia, Muslims in Indonesia, where they regularly send their students over to Sham or to Egypt. They speak Arabic, they understand Arabic, and then they bring ulama over from Sham or from Egypt, and they come, they do courses, they deliver classes in Arabic. They'll teach fiqh, they'll teach usul al-fiqh, they'll teach a metin or something, and then they'll fly back. So there's this constant exchange going on, and this
Renewal.
is. Yeah, and this is what Muslims in the Anglosphere need to do. Depending on your madhab, whether you're Shafis, if you're Malikis, there should be some sort of program where you're sending people back and forth to Morocco or Mauritania or whatever it is. This is really, really crucial to not cut off. And there's a nice counterbalance to this wretched education system. The next point we wrote down here was the willing and the able.
Now, when we discuss the willing and the able, you need to understand this when you start to make these changes. There are some of the slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when they realize what's happened and they want to start making changes. When they want to start making changes, they find that sometimes they don't have as much support as they thought they would get. So they become despondent. They become embittered. And so they start to say, what's wrong with these people? Why won't they do this? Why won't they do that? These people, they're cursed, or I hate these people. I try to help them and they won't help me back. You have to understand when we're discussing the willing and the able. The willing are not always able, and the able are not always willing. There are those who may be able to assist you, but they're not willing to, because what has been created with the current setup here, they benefit from, they eat from, they devour from, and they nourish themselves from this structure. Then you have those who are willing, but they're not able. They're not able to assist you because they may not have the funding. They may not understand all of what's happening. They may not grasp the ramifications. They want what's best. They know that. But when you're explaining it to them, they don't fully grasp the gravity of the matter. They don't see the full thing in relief. They can't step back and see the full picture. They can only see the paints. Those people still deserve your help because they're still from the body of Muslims. They're still from the common slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't expect the common Muslims to jump in and necessarily do something with you because they don't owe you anything. You owe the common Muslim. If you're a student of knowledge, you're learning this religion and you're striving, you owe them. They don't owe you anything. So if you teach them and they learn and you build something up and they do something and everything else, and they come for a period of time and then they go away and then someone else comes, don't become embittered and think that you're entitled to like several thank yous and praise and things like that, because they don't have to do that. They're the common slaves of Allah. You chose that vocation. That's your vocation that you chose. And by choosing that vocation, you've become indebted to them. They don't owe you anything. And when you understand that, you can work more effectively and more consistently when you understand that all praise, glory, and goodness is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you give it to Him. And that what good is going to come, and whatever bad will come is either from yourself or from some other affair that's come about that you brought about. But that irrespective of everything else, you must strive. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send the assistance that you need, but don't assume that everyone must get in line because they may not be able to see the vision. And an example of this is the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he started digging the trench. Some of the companions didn't grasp what he was doing. It wasn't until they saw him several feet down digging that they realized, we understand what he's doing, right? There was one companion named Amr who saw that vision. He did the digging. He wound up falling, breaking his neck, and dying shaheed. But the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he started it. He started off the process. Don't look for people to start it with you. Begin the process and start to create the systematic things that are necessary with you and your family, those that are under your care. And you will start to see other people will appear. But don't wait for them to, don't command them to, and don't insist that they must, because there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of other issues going on, and they're not beholden to you.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that also comes up, in, like an example of this, even if you don't set up an institution, if you go like down the route of homeschooling, you are going to get a lot of opposition from people, because a lot of people, they cannot grasp this idea of, oh my God, your kid's not going to go through the whole school system. How is he going to get his education? How is he or she going to
How will he socialize?
Yeah, he won't be part of the system, and how will he or she get a job in the future?
How will he survive?
Yeah, they think it's like a death sentence, and so you're going to have to fight against that, battle against that. But and I've seen this. I've seen people from my own family doing this, where they have striven really hard, and they've homeschooled their kids, and and eventually, alhamdulillah, this is one of the benefits of the internet age and social media, is that you can link up with other people. You can find other like-minded families who are struggling the same way, and then you guys can get together. You can have study groups. You can have you can share resources. You can share materials. You can go on class trips together. And your kids can make friends with those kids, and there's so much events. Yeah, there's so much stuff you can do. There's so many tools at your disposal that you can find a way out of this. And this is one of the interesting things. Again, one of the blessings of this quote unquote pandemic is, and I read a study about this recently, where so many parents in the UK, in the US, other parts of the world, were just thrown into the homeschooling deep end. They're just okay, your kid is going to be at school at home with you for the next 5 months.
Steep learning curve.
You do something. You figure it out. And they're just left with no resource. They have they think, I have to go to work, I have a job, or the mother's thinking, I have a husband who's going out for the day, I'll obviously be by myself. And some of them, instead of sinking, they've managed to swim. And they've done so well over the past few months, they're now thinking, you know what? I'm not sending my kid back to school.
Not going back there.
Because I'm seeing so much progress. My kids are so happy. They're really loving it. We're having a great time. I'm spending quality time with my kids. They're spending quality time with me. They're not going back. And we're going to see, like, again, there's this big debate now in the U.S. about schools opening in the fall, the autumn for UK people. There's a lot of people are now saying, well, the schools don't open. You know what? Cut off the funding. give us our money back, and we'll use that money. We'll use that money for our own, to set up homeschooling programs and so on and so forth. So it can happen, it can work. And so don't always assume that because it's the only thing you've ever known, that it's the only thing that's ever worked. You have to really, no. Schooling is not something that's been there since the beginning of time. You know, the current schooling system came from Prussia. It's maybe 150 years old. People survive without it, just as people, you know, the human race survived without vaccines. The human race survived without
police,
and so on and so forth. It's not. Don't just assume that because it's here now, it's all you've ever known in your life. It doesn't mean that the human race needs it, and everyone needs it in order to continue. So we've spoken for an hour and 40 minutes. Any closing thoughts?
My main statement, I'd say, in closing this, I'd say is to take away perhaps three things. Is one, the most treasured possession of a believer should be that he desires to guard the foundation of his faith, the very asl of his iman. He should strive to guard this. Number two, he should understand the world that is around him and understand the things that are occurring in his midst. Then number three, he should look at those that are under his influence, his children, his wife, his immediate family. They have the most right to his assistance, the most right to his help, the most right to his nasiha when they need it. And so he must strive to make sure this is always the case. And if he does that, there will be real change that comes, and there will be real progress that is made in a way in which the felicity is seen in both this life and the akhirah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil
Alameen. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Inshallah, we will meet again soon for another podcast. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.